Imagine waking up, not in your modern bedroom with clean sheets and the smell of laundry detergent, but in a small 14th century medieval house. It's barely dawn, but the town is already bustling with activity. You push open the heavy wooden door of your home and in an instant, you're swept away by an atmosphere that's anything but familiar. The first thing that attacks you is not the light, nor the noise, but the smell, a dense, suffocating mixture, difficult to describe in a single word. It stings the throat and makes one instinctively recoil. In the air hangs a powerful scent of manure, for the streets serve both as a path and a stable for horses, donkeys, and sometimes pigs. Adding to this already heavy base is the more rancid smell of garbage. Fish scraps thrown away by housewives, vegetable peelings rotting in the mud, pieces of meat left to rot. Above all this, the scent of human and animal urine mixes with the acrid odors of tanned leather and burnt wood. You barely breathe and you immediately understand that every inspiration is a test. Today, our garbage is collected weekly, the streets are washed, and the sewers are invisible. But here, everything is open to the air. What can't be used ends up outside. The concept of waste, as we know it, doesn't yet exist. The street is a communal trash can, a living cesspool. Beneath your feet, it's not a smooth or paved roadway as you might hope, but an uneven surface of packed earth, pools of stagnant water and greasy mud. With each step, your shoes sink in slightly, sucked in by the mixture of rain, manure, and garbage. In places you can see cobblestones, but they're slippery, covered in grime, and almost as treacherous as mud. You tread carefully, for one false step could mean falling into the disgusting material. The noises, however, are constant, even deafening. Shouts erupt from all sides. The fishmonger boasts of his catch from the day before, already covered in flies. A peddler offers tallow candles, a woman yells at her child to come inside. Horses' hooves echo on the stones, accompanied by the clatter of rickety cart wheels. Stray dogs bark, fighting over a bone thrown in the middle of the street. At regular intervals, one also hears the more solemn sound of church bells, marking the time in a society where few own clocks. But that's not all. You have to look up. For if the ground is a permanent trap, the sky of the medieval streets offers no more security. The tall houses, huddled together, barely let any light through. And sometimes a window suddenly opens. A voice shouts a brief warning, "Watch out for the water." And a bucket of urine or dirty water spills into the street. With any luck, you're not in the way. If you're not, you end up splashed by the contents. For us, this would be unimaginable, punishable by law. But here it's routine. This is how residents dispose of their used liquids. The smell becomes even stronger as you pass by the workshops. The tanners, for example, work animal hides with products whose odor is absolutely unbearable. Urine, dog excrement, lime. Their stalls literally fill the neighborhood with perfume. The butchers, for their part, throw blood and viscera into the gutters, which attracts a swarm of insects. And all this slowly flows into the gutters that run along the street before reaching the river. If you remain motionless for a few moments, you begin to feel the gaze of others on you. Passers-by, dressed in heavy, coarse, rarely washed wool, themselves bear the imprint of this rudimentary hygiene. Their clothes exude a smell of rancid sweat and dust. Their hair is greasy, often covered with a veil or hat to mask its condition. Their teeth? Few in number, often blackened by time and poor diet. Everyone is bathed in the same odor, so much so that no one really seems to pay attention to it. What is unbearable for you is simply normal for them. And that is what is most shocking, the contrast with our modern habits. Today, the slightest stench in a bus or metro station provokes grimaces, sighs, and sometimes even complaints. But in the Middle Ages, the entire city smelled of summer metro, all the time, multiplied by 100, without air conditioning, without deodorant, without scented soap. This simple sensory dive into a medieval street is enough to understand the extent to which hygiene, or rather the lack of it, shaped daily life. Every walk through town, every trip to the market, every step outside meant facing a sea of noise, smells, and dirt. Comparison with our modern hygiene standards. When you mentally leave this suffocating medieval street and return to the reality of your modern daily life, the contrast is so brutal that it becomes almost comical. Today you wake up in an airy room where the air smells clean. You push back the sheets, washed last week with scented detergent, and walk on a dry, stable, clean floor. At no time do you fear stepping into a puddle of mud mixed with waste. And if your neighbor throws his dirty water, it's down a sink that sends it directly to an invisible sewer system. The difference between these two worlds isn't just measured in centuries, but in a health revolution. Whereas medieval city dwellers constantly breathed in a cocktail of stench, you have the luxury of air purified by ventilation, filters, and even air conditioning. If a trash can is left outside for too long, its odor immediately becomes unbearable, and a collection truck comes to remove it within the day or week. The Middle Ages, on the other hand, had neither collection services nor the concept of household waste. What couldn't be reused ended up directly in the street, in the gutter, or in the nearby river. As a result, medieval towns were bathed in their own detritus. Consider a commonplace gesture of our time: taking a shower. An automatic, daily act for many, sometimes even twice a day. The water runs freely, hot or cold, and a simple soap leaves the skin with a pleasant scent. In a few minutes, sweat, dust, and germs disappear. In the Middle Ages, this ritual was practically non-existent. Not only was water not available in abundance, but medical beliefs of the time sometimes associated bathing with a risk of illness, as it was thought that water opened the pores and allowed bad influences to enter the body. Thus, washing became almost suspect. And what about sheets and clothing? Today, you change your t-shirt as soon as it smells a little sweaty, you put it in the washing machine, and the laundry comes out clean, soft, and fragrant. In the medieval world, washing clothes was a luxury and a colossal chore. Most people wore the same clothes for weeks, even months, without washing. Underwear, when you had any, wasn't changed regularly. The fabrics absorbed sweat, grease, dust, and literally served as a second skin. Imagine the smell of a t-shirt after a week without washing. Now multiply that by 10 or 20, and you're starting to get close to medieval reality. The same goes for teeth. We have toothpaste, sophisticated plastic toothbrushes, and antibacterial mouthwashes. The slightest dental problem sends us to the dentist, who has precise tools and medications. But in the Middle Ages, toothbrushing was almost non-existent. People sometimes rubbed their gums with a cloth or herbs, but oral hygiene wasn't a priority. The result? Foul breath, rotten teeth, infections, and chronic pain. The smell of a medieval crowd must have been an olfactory experience in its own right, and not in a positive way. Another striking comparison: sewers. Today, we don't even think about what happens to the water in our toilets. It simply disappears, thanks to invisible but gigantic infrastructures. Modern cities have invested billions in sanitation. In the Middle Ages, most cities had nothing like this. Cesspits filled and overflowed, rivers served as both dumping grounds and a source of drinking water. The water you drink today, clear, filtered, and bacteria-free, would have seemed miraculous to a medieval person, accustomed to drinking cloudy, often contaminated water, hence the frequent use of light beer or wine as a daily beverage. Even the body smells different. Today we have deodorants, perfumes, and moisturizers. We live in a world where olfactory neutrality is the norm, where smelling strong is considered a social fault. But in medieval Europe, everyone carried a veritable odor signature made up of sweat, body fat, and smoke-soaked clothing and dust. The wealthy tried to mask these odors with perfumes or sachets of fragrant herbs sewn into their clothing. But for the majority, the stench was simply normal. Finally, there is animal management. In our cities, dogs are kept on leashes, their droppings are picked up, and horses no longer have a place on the streets. But in the Middle Ages, animals roamed freely. Pigs rummaged through garbage, horses left behind steaming piles, dogs wandered and bred unchecked. Animals were an integral part of the urban landscape, but they brought with them parasites, fleas, droppings, barking, and bites. In short, comparing our modern habits with those of the past, we realize that hygiene is not a simple convenience, but a true invisible revolution that structures our lives. Our mundane actions, washing our hands, taking out the trash, flushing the toilet, are in reality the fruit of centuries of technical, medical, and cultural progress. Where the Middle Ages wallowed in filth, we live in a sanitized bubble whose value we no longer even imagine. Why medieval hygiene is fascinating. At this point, a natural question arises: why so much interest in the filth of the Middle Ages? After all, everyone knows that ancient times were less clean than they are today. But to reduce this observation to a simple comparison would be to miss a crucial reality. Medieval hygiene shaped the world we live in. Let's start with health. The lack of hygiene in medieval towns wasn't just unpleasant to the sense of smell. It provided an ideal breeding ground for disease. Outbreaks of the plague, for example, would never have been so widespread without the explosive combination of filth, overcrowding, and medical ignorance. Rats proliferated in the garbage-clogged streets, fleas passed from animal to animal before reaching humans, and the inhabitants, weakened by malnutrition and poor personal hygiene, were easy prey. Every medieval town was, in a way, a vast open-air laboratory for the spread of infection. But it wasn't just about spectacular diseases like the Black Death. Medieval daily life was marked by a multitude of ordinary ailments that we have forgotten. Chronic diarrhea due to contaminated water, skin diseases caused by dirt, untreated dental infections, intestinal parasites. Today, a simple stomach bug can wear us out for a few days. In the Middle Ages, it could kill, especially children. Filth was not a backdrop, but an invisible, omnipresent actor that directly influenced the life expectancy and destiny of millions of people. Then there was society. Hygiene was not uniform. It varied according to social class. The wealthy could afford finer fabrics, sometimes washed by their servants, and used perfumes to mask odors. The poor, on the other hand, literally lived in filth, torn between the need to work hard and the lack of means to wash or dress properly. Thus, bodily odor and appearance became social markers. Recognizing the smell of the poor was not a metaphor. It was a tangible reality on the medieval streets. This difference was also reflected in urban organization. Certain neighborhoods inhabited by dirty trades like tanners or butchers were known for their stench. Living there meant being exposed not only to the smell but also to social contempt. The medieval hierarchy was therefore not only political or economic, it was also olfactory. Finally, hygiene also affects culture and mentalities. Contrary to what one might believe, medieval people were not unaware of the existence of dirt. But they had a different conception of the body and cleanliness. For some religious figures, excessive washing could be a sign of vanity, a sin. The body was not seen as needing to be purified by water, but by prayer and spiritual discipline. Thus, filth became almost a sign of humility. In other contexts, body odor was perceived as inevitable, a part of human nature. Perfumes, herbs, and incense were then used not to eliminate dirt, but to mask or symbolically transcend it. What makes this subject fascinating is this discrepancy. For us, hygiene is a given, a vital necessity, a fundamental right. For them, it was secondary, sometimes even suspect. And this discrepancy explains many things. Why epidemics were so devastating, why certain medical practices seem absurd, why smell itself played a social and symbolic role. We then understand that medieval hygiene is not just a disgusting curiosity, it is a key to understanding the Middle Ages. It is a gateway to mentalities, social inequalities, religious beliefs, and even the history of medicine. By exploring this subject, we discover not only how people lived, but also why they lived that way and how their choices, constraints, and beliefs shaped our shared history. And if today we wash our hands mechanically, if we take drinking water for granted, if we breathe relatively pure air, it is partly because the Middle Ages showed us, by contrast, the cost of a lack of hygiene. This introduction is therefore not just a repugnant picture of mud and stench. It is the gateway to a historical investigation that will reveal to us, step by step, why medieval hygiene was absolutely disgusting, and how this filth has forever marked the evolution of our societies. The legacy of antiquity. To appreciate just how absolutely disgusting medieval hygiene must have seemed, we must first recall what existed before. For paradoxically, Europe had already known, several centuries earlier, a model of public hygiene that has nothing to envy of certain modern standards, that of the Roman Empire. The Romans, long before the Middle Ages, understood the importance of water and cleanliness. Throughout the empire, gigantic aqueducts were built, veritable stone cathedrals designed to transport water over dozens of kilometers. This water supplied public fountains, the homes of the elite, but above all the thermal baths. These immense bathing complexes were hygiene, relaxation, and social life combined. In Rome, Carthage, Trier, and Arles, the thermal baths were meeting places, almost sacred. To enter a thermal bath was to enter an orderly world. Heated rooms, caldarium; cold rooms, frigidarium; warm baths, tepidarium. People washed there, received massages, and discussed business or philosophy. Roman citizens considered bathing a daily practice, almost as essential as eating. Even the poorest could access these public baths for a nominal fee. Added to this was an impressive sanitation system. Rome already had a monumental sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, which carried away the city's wastewater. Provincial cities had their own pipes, communal latrines with running water, and regularly cleaned cobbled streets. Cleanliness wasn't perfect, of course, but the organization and infrastructure prevented cities from turning into unsanitary cesspools. Then came the fall. With the gradual disintegration of the Roman Empire, starting in the 5th century, all this heritage began to crumble. The aqueducts were no longer maintained. The thermal baths, costly in terms of energy and maintenance, fell into disrepair. The sewer systems became clogged, due to a lack of skilled labor and the political will to repair them. The cities emptied, and the inhabitants retreated to smaller, less wealthy villages, less able to support such infrastructure. This disappearance of public baths was a turning point. Whereas bathing had been a daily ritual in antiquity, it gradually became rare, even suspect, in the Middle Ages. The elites continued for a time to imitate Roman practices, but without a water network, without thermal baths, without sewers, bathing ceased to be a collective norm. It once again became an occasional activity, reserved for certain occasions or for the most fortunate. This decline was not only material but also cultural. The memory of the Roman baths survived in the majestic ruins that medieval people still saw in their cities. But these vestiges seemed almost supernatural, belonging to a vanished civilization, too distant to be imitated. In the medieval imagination, Rome was above all a political and military power. Few remembered its culture of water and cleanliness. It is important to emphasize this paradox. Medieval Europe was not ignorant of hygiene by nature. It had inherited a refined model which it abandoned. This was a spectacular regression. Where the Romans bathed every day, a medieval European could go months without washing. Where the Romans had latrines with running water, the medieval population made do with a rudimentary pit or dumped their waste in the street. One might think the decline was abrupt, but in reality it was gradual. In some regions, public baths survived into the early Middle Ages. In Constantinople, the heir to Rome, the baths continued to function much longer. But in Western Europe, the decline was inexorable. Lack of infrastructure, wars, famines, and general insecurity put survival before comfort. The Roman legacy was not lost on everyone, however. Arab scholars, for their part, preserved and developed this taste for water, with hammams becoming an integral part of Islamic culture. When Europeans encountered these practices during the Crusades, they were struck by the contrast. The Muslims, clean and perfumed, versus the crusading knights, covered in sweat, mud, and grime. Thus, from the beginning of the Middle Ages, the scene was set. Europe had entered an era where public cleanliness had ceased to be a priority. Far from the aqueducts, baths, and sewers of the Roman era, medieval cities were transformed into places of chronic insalubrity. This regression was not only technological but also mental. People had forgotten that another model of hygiene was possible. The medieval vision of the body. While the Romans considered the body a temple of cleanliness and health, the Middle Ages had a very different approach. To understand this transformation, we must enter into the mentality of the time, an era in which spirituality and morality dominated all spheres of life, including those of the human body. At the heart of medieval thought, the body was not a mere physical tool. It was seen as a fragile receptacle of the soul, a domain where passions, sins, and illnesses could infiltrate. The body was suspect. Physical pleasure, including that of warm water on the skin, was sometimes associated with pride or lust. The idea of washing frequently, especially for pleasure, could therefore be seen as a sign of vanity. This vision was reinforced by religious and philosophical texts. Medieval authors emphasized the contrast between spiritual purity and bodily temptations. Baths were not forbidden, but they were often governed by strict rules. A bath had to be useful, ritual, or medicinal, never simply for comfort or beauty. Daily hygiene as we understand it today did not exist. Cleanliness was secondary to morality. Contemporary accounts describe an ambivalent relationship with water. Monasteries practiced certain ritual washings. Monks washed their hands before meals and sometimes their faces, but full-body baths remained rare. Some saints and religious authors, such as Bernard of Clairvaux, warned against excessive hygiene. Washing too often could distract from spiritual contemplation and fuel pride. The elites, for their part, sometimes sought to circumvent this distrust. Nobles could bathe on special occasions, but it was not a daily habit. Even royalty applied these rules intermittently. Documents show that baths were taken on ceremonial occasions or to treat certain illnesses, not routinely. This perception of the body also influenced healthcare practices. Medieval medicine, based on the theory of humors, saw the balance of bodily fluids as central. Physicians recommended targeted washing to treat specific imbalances, but not for regular maintenance of cleanliness. The idea that sweat, dirt, or excrement could promote disease was well known, but it was often overridden by moral and religious prudence. In both cities and the countryside, this mental outlook shaped daily life. People rarely washed more than once or twice a year in some regions, especially during the winter, and even then, often in cold water to avoid excesses deemed dangerous. Cleanliness was not a social norm. Living in filth was considered normal, almost inevitable. This relationship with the body largely explains why medieval hygiene seems shocking to us today. It wasn't just a lack of infrastructure or technical knowledge, but an entire culture that placed the purity of the soul above the cleanliness of the body. Filth wasn't simply tolerated, it was integrated into the way of thinking and living. So, before even talking about rare baths or streets infested with garbage, it is important to understand that the Middle Ages had a particular vision of the body, which profoundly differentiated it from antiquity. This perception would influence all aspects of hygiene, from the frequency of washing to the standards for cleaning houses, streets, and clothing. Medieval man lived in a world where dirt was normal, and sometimes even considered virtuous. The influence of religion on hygiene. In the Middle Ages, religion permeated every aspect of life, and hygiene was no exception. The omnipresent church dictated what was acceptable and forbidden, not only in spirituality, but also in everyday behavior, including those related to water and bathing. A key concept was the sin of vanity. Washing too often, caring for one's body for pleasure, or striving to appear beautiful could be considered a sign of pride, a diversion of the soul's attention to superficial concerns. Excessive cleanliness was suspect, sometimes denounced in sermons as a distraction from the spiritual life. Public baths, inherited from Roman tradition, were particularly affected by this distrust. Christian monasteries and cities viewed these places as potential hotbeds of lust. Records indicate that some baths were closed or strictly regulated to prevent excesses and immoral behavior. In several cities, religious authorities imposed restrictions. Men and women had to bathe separately, sometimes at specific times, and prolonged or mixed bathing was prohibited. Yet religion did not completely ban water. Monasteries practiced specific ritual washings, washing hands before meals, purifying oneself before prayer, and even bathing for medical or symbolic reasons. These monastic practices show that cleanliness was not completely ignored, but it was strictly regulated and subordinated to the spiritual life. Some medieval saints and writers, such as Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, criticized frequent public bathing. They associated water with temptation and carnal pleasure. The fear of arousing desire, lust, or pride therefore guided washing habits. In this context, it is not surprising that ordinary people washed very rarely, and that the idea of regular bathing has disappeared from popular culture. Religion also influenced clothing hygiene. Washing or changing clothes too frequently could be considered a form of vanity. Clothes were therefore worn for long periods of time, sometimes until they became unbreathable or infested with parasites. The modern concept of clean clothing was unknown to most Europeans. Finally, the religious perception of filth varied according to social class. For the nobility, the scarcity of baths was compensated for by perfumery and luxurious clothing practices, which masked odors and dirt. For peasants, bodily cleanliness was minimal and dictated by survival and work, not by formal spiritual prescriptions. But even among the elites, the principles of temperance and modesty limited the use of water. Thus, religion played a paradoxical role. It promoted a certain ritualized hygiene, but condemned the pleasure of bathing and bodily vanity. This duality helped create a society where dirt was not only tolerated, but often valued as a sign of piety and moral discipline. Ultimately, religion shaped a world where bathing became rare, the body suspect, and dirt normalized, setting the stage for the unsanitary conditions that would characterize medieval towns and villages. Distrust of water, bathing, and bodily cleanliness, while influenced by spiritual beliefs, had direct consequences for public health and quality of life. Medieval towns and insalubrity. Urban life in the Middle Ages was a surprising mix of commercial dynamism, thriving culture, and omnipresent filth. Medieval towns, despite their activity and growing populations, were organized in ways that reflected minimal hygiene and poor infrastructure. The streets were narrow, often unevenly paved, and without systematic sewers. Residents threw their household waste, food scraps, excrement, sewage, directly into the street or into open pits. Horses and other draft animals added their share, leaving behind mud and dung. Walking these streets became a veritable obstacle course. Garbage mixed with stagnant rainwater, creating a cocktail of odors, bacteria, and vermin. Markets, centers of commerce and gathering places, were particularly problematic. Meat and fish stalls stood side by side with garbage, exposing the produce to contamination. Rats and other pests proliferated in these conditions, carrying diseases and fleas. Epidemics were never far away. The Black Death of the 14th century is a tragic example. Public infrastructure, when it existed, was rudimentary. Wells and fountains sometimes provided drinking water, but they were few in number and often contaminated. Communal latrines existed, but their maintenance was irregular, and they were often located too close to homes and water sources. This proximity encouraged the spread of disease and reinforced the unsanitary nature of the cities. In the villages, the situation was different but equally problematic. Residents lived more widely spread out, which reduced the concentration of waste and pests, but the scarcity of running water and sanitation facilities made washing just as limited. Water was collected from rivers, wells, or ponds, often shared with animals. Daily cleanliness was therefore the exception, not the norm. It is important to understand that this unsanitary situation was not solely due to a lack of scientific knowledge. Religious beliefs, views of the body, and a lack of priority given to cleanliness played a central role. Washing frequently or investing in a collective sewage system was seen as unnecessary, even morally suspect. This combination of factors created an environment where dirt became normal, almost natural. Residents adapted. Certain areas were avoided, perfumes and herbs were used to mask odors, and very limited toilet rituals were developed. Yet, to a modern observer, medieval cities appear as absolutely disgusting spaces, saturated with waste and unsanitary conditions, far from the Roman ideal or our current standards. In short, medieval cities were a breeding ground for systemic filth, a result of the abandonment of ancient infrastructure, religious beliefs, and cultural practices that valued bodily restraint. It is this unique mix that explains why medieval hygiene was not only scarce, but often insufficient to protect public health. Medieval countryside and rural hygiene. While medieval towns suffered from chronic insalubrity, the countryside was not necessarily cleaner. However, rural life had its own dynamics, linked to space, resources, and the agricultural way of life. Villages were scattered and often built around farms or hamlets. This dispersion allowed for better waste dilution and lower concentrations of pests compared to cities. But running water was scarce, and residents relied on wells, rivers, or ponds for drinking, cooking, and washing. These sources were often shared with livestock, increasing the risk of contamination. Personal hygiene remained minimal. Washing was sporadic and often seasonal. Cold water from rivers or lakes was used mainly in spring and summer. In winters, swimming was almost non-existent. Soap, when it existed, was expensive and reserved for medicinal uses or the rural elite. For the majority of peasants, cleanliness was limited to scrubbing hands, faces, and feet, or changing clothes when possible. Washing clothes and linens was laborious and expensive in terms of water and fuel. People rarely washed textiles, and they could be infested with bedbugs and fleas for months. Dirty clothes and bodies were therefore in almost permanent condition. Hygiene practices were often guided by superstition or folk medicine. Aromatic herbs and infusions were used to mask odors or protect against disease, rather than to effectively cleanse the body. Baths, when taken, served more therapeutic purposes than comfort. For peasants, outdoor life and manual labor were normal, making daily dirt unavoidable. Soil, manure, livestock, and crops soaked into clothes and skin, and this was accepted as a natural condition of rural life. Despite these constraints, some villages developed local solutions. Rivers served as collective washing areas, and some communities had rules to keep waste away from homes and wells. But these efforts remained limited and did not meet modern hygiene standards. Thus, medieval rural life reflected minimal hygiene, structured by access to water, religion, folk medicine, and the harshness of everyday life. Compared to cities, it may have seemed slightly less unsanitary due to space and the dilution of waste, but personal cleanliness remained rare and basic. In short, the countryside and the city shared a common reality. The Middle Ages lived in a world where filth was normal, and modern standards of cleanliness were simply unknown. Personal hygiene and baths. Personal hygiene in the Middle Ages was radically different from what we know today. For the majority of people, frequent washing was rare, even considered unnecessary or even suspect. The rarity of baths. Unlike the Romans who had public baths, medieval Europeans bathed sporadically. For peasants, a full bath might only take place once or twice a year, often in spring or summer, when water was accessible and the air warm enough to avoid the risk of hypothermia. Elites might bathe more frequently, but even among the nobility, regular bathing was not the norm. Fear of the sin of vanity played a central role. Excessive washing could be seen as a sign of pride or lust. Baths were therefore often quick and pragmatic, intended to cleanse the skin of visible excess dirt, but never to satisfy personal comfort or pleasure. Toilet practices. When bathing was done, it could be in a rudimentary tub filled with heated water or in public rivers and lakes. The water was not changed frequently, and communal bathing was sometimes hazardous from a sanitary perspective. Rubbing with cloths or herbs was used to remove dirt, but its effectiveness was limited. Daily washing often consisted of wiping the face, hands, and feet, or wiping certain parts of the body with a damp cloth. Soap existed, but it was rare and expensive, reserved for medical purposes or for the elite. Cold water was the norm, as hot water required wood and time to heat, both precious resources. Hair and beard management. Hair and beards were rarely washed. Powders or herbs were sometimes used to mask odors or repel lice and parasites. Medieval hairstyles often reflected the difficulty of keeping hair clean. Long hair tied back or styled to limit contact with dirt, or braids and hats to protect the scalp. Attitudes towards water. Water itself was often viewed with suspicion. It was believed that it could carry disease if it was too cold or stagnant. The fear of lust associated with communal bathing reinforced this distrust. Thus, locals rarely associated water with cleanliness or pleasure, but rather with a utilitarian or ritual act. Hide the dirt. To compensate for the lack of frequent bathing, people used perfumes, powders, and changing clothes to mask odors. Aromatic herbs, vinegars, or certain spices were used to neutralize unpleasant body odors. But these methods did not replace the actual action of washing, and bodies often remained covered in dirt, sweat, and parasites. In summary, medieval personal hygiene was sporadic, limited, and regulated by religion and culture, with a high tolerance for dirt. The contrast with our modern standards, where daily showering and personal care are the norm, makes medieval reality shocking to our contemporary gaze. Cleanliness of clothing and linen. Medieval hygiene was not limited to the body. Clothing and textiles played an equally crucial role in the perception of cleanliness. For the majority of inhabitants, clothes were worn for long periods without washing, often until they became unbearably dirty or infested with parasites. Washing frequency and techniques. Washing clothes was laborious and costly in terms of time and resources. Wool or linen garments required large quantities of water and wood to heat it. Soap, already scarce for body wash, was even more so for laundry. Peasants sometimes washed their clothes in rivers or ponds, using stone beating to remove dust and dirt. But these washes were sporadic and were not enough to remove stubborn stains or parasites. Elites could send their laundry to professional launderers, but even their thorough cleaning was rare and limited to certain rooms. The accumulation of dirt. Wearing the same clothes for weeks or months meant that sweat, dust, and animal feces accumulated in the textile fibers. Parasites, fleas, lice, moths, proliferated in these clothes, contributing to the spread of disease. Undergarments were rarely changed, and some texts mention that shirts served as both night and day clothes, exposing the body to bacteria for extended periods. Practices to mask the smell. To limit the effects of unsanitary conditions, people used various tricks. Aromatic herbs could be sewn into clothing or placed in wardrobes. Vinegar or certain dyes were used to neutralize odors. Clothes could also be exposed to sunlight and air to partially disinfect them, but these methods were far from effective. The social importance of clothing. Despite the dirt, clothing remained a crucial social marker. Nobles and bourgeois sought to display their status through the quality and color of their textiles, even if these garments were rarely perfectly clean. This social priority reinforced the contrast between appearance and actual cleanliness. One could be richly dressed but physically covered in filth and parasites. Health consequences. Poor clothing maintenance contributed to the spread of disease and parasites. Fleas and lice carried fevers and infections, while clothing soaked in sweat and dirt promoted skin irritations and infections. Thus, cleanliness of clothing was as much a health issue as a social image issue. In short, medieval clothing reflected minimal hygiene. Prolonged wear, lack of washing, and tolerance of parasites were normal, and only certain tricks were used to mask dirt. Compared to our modern standards, where linen is washed regularly and underwear changed daily, the contrast is striking and reinforces the idea that medieval hygiene was absolutely disgusting. Comparisons with other civilizations. To fully understand how shocking Western medieval hygiene could be, it is helpful to compare it with other contemporary cultures, which had developed much more advanced bodily and social practices. The Muslim world and hammams. In the Muslim world, cleanliness occupied a central place in daily life. The Quran and Islamic tradition prescribed regular ablutions before prayer, and the notion of bodily purification was intimately linked to spirituality. Hammams, or public baths, were widespread and accessible to all social classes. These baths combined heat, steam, and massage to provide a complete cleansing of the body. The water was renewed regularly, and the establishments were often well maintained. Western travelers to Muslim cities noted the cleanliness of the people and public spaces, and some reported a mixture of wonder and discomfort at this contrast with their own medieval cities. China and Japan, ritual cleanliness. In China, hygiene was also taken very seriously. Both elites and the general public practiced regular baths, used perfumes, and paid particular attention to the cleanliness of their clothing and homes. Purification rituals accompanied certain ceremonies and daily activities, integrating hygiene into cultural and social life. In Japan, the notion of cleanliness was deeply rooted in society. Public baths, onsen and sento, were common, and regular washing of the body and clothes was part of social norms. Dirt was not tolerated, and bodily and domestic cleanliness also had a spiritual and moral dimension. The late medieval West. By comparison, medieval Europe was significantly behind the times. Fear of the sin of vanity, distrust of water, and the lack of public bathing facilities limited hygienic practices. Cities were filthy, streets littered with garbage, and residents rarely washed. Even the elites failed to achieve the standards of cleanliness observed elsewhere. This delay was partly due to the abandonment of Roman infrastructure, such as baths, and the spread of religious and medical beliefs that associated frequent bathing with illness or lust. Reactions from foreign travelers. Travelers to medieval Europe frequently noted the filth and unsanitary conditions of cities. Ibn Battuta, for example, who traveled throughout the Muslim world and visited parts of Europe, expressed astonishment at the state of the streets and the scarcity of baths. His descriptions of filth and odors contrasted with the clean, orderly cities he had seen elsewhere. These comparisons reinforced the idea that medieval Western hygiene was not only inadequate by our modern standards, but that it represented a marked delay compared to other contemporary civilizations, where cleanliness the church and the morality of filth. The medieval church exerted a major influence on all aspects of daily life, including hygiene practices. Its moral and religious outlook helped shape attitudes toward cleanliness, often to the detriment of health. 1. Excessive cleanliness considered vanity. In medieval doctrine, the vanity and lust were sins to be avoided. Excessive bodily cleanliness was sometimes equated with pride or a desire to seduce. Sermons and religious writings warned against obsession with the body, which some clerics saw as a spiritual danger. This moralizing perception of dirt influenced the behavior of the faithful. Washing too frequently could be frowned upon, while tolerating a certain bodily negligence was considered a virtue of simplicity and humility. 2. The limited practices of monks. Monks and nuns, expected to set an example of piety, often adopted very limited bathing practices. Monastic rules recommended the moderate use of water, both to avoid the temptation of lust and to focus on the spiritual life. Some orders used water only for ritual ablutions or for occasional needs, which reinforced the idea that bodily cleanliness was not a moral priority. 3. Religious contradictions. Yet the Church itself sometimes required the use of water. Religious rituals, such as baptism, sprinkling with holy water or purification before certain ceremonies, required direct contact with water. These contradictions created tensions. The faithful were encouraged to limit bathing to avoid vanity, while being confronted with religious practices where water was essential. This ambivalence contributed to uneven and irregular personal hygiene in medieval society. 4. Impact on social perception of dirt. The influence of the Church had a lasting impact on the social perception of dirt. The relative neglect of hygiene was often morally justified, reinforcing the contrast with other diseases and epidemics related to hygiene. The ubiquitous filth in medieval towns and villages was not just an aesthetic or olfactory problem. It had direct consequences for health. The lack of sanitation systems, rarely washed clothes and bedding, and the scarcity of baths made the population extremely vulnerable to disease. 1. Common diseases. Several infections were directly linked to poor hygiene. Skin diseases, scabies, boils, lice and itching were common, aggravated by rarely washed clothes and infested bedding. Intestinal infections. Dysentery, typhoid and cholera spread easily due to contamination of water and food by human and animal excrement. Parasites. Fleas, ticks and intestinal worms were common, amplifying daily suffering. 2. Major epidemics. Poor hygiene contributed to the severity of major epidemics. The Black Death, 14th century, spread by fleas and rats attracted by urban filth. It killed millions of people in Europe. Minor epidemics of fever and flu. Common in crowded cities, they were aggravated by poor ventilation, stagnant water and general unsanitary conditions. Smallpox and measles. Promiscuity and the lack of hygiene care facilitated the rapid transmission of these diseases. 3. Transmission mechanisms linked to insalubrity. Contaminated water, muddy streets, and trash left out in the open created a perfect environment for the spread of infections. Rats, flies, and other insects acted as vectors, carrying microbes and parasites from the dirt to humans. In addition, the frequent sharing of bedding, the infrequency of baths, and the prolonged wearing of dirty clothes increased contact with these infectious agents. 4. Reactions and prevention attempts. Despite the limited knowledge of microbiology, some rudimentary measures were adopted. Ban on throwing rubbish in the streets in certain cities. Creation of collective pits and latrines to limit contamination. Spices and perfumes used to mask odors, with very limited effect on health. However, these measures were often insufficient, and the majority of the population continued to live in unsanitary conditions. 5. Impact on society. Unsanitary conditions and epidemics profoundly shaped medieval society. High infant mortality and reduced life expectancy. Constant fear of disease in densely populated cities. Social and religious pressure to justify health misery on moral or divine grounds. Food and culinary hygiene. Medieval hygiene was not limited to the body and the streets. Food preparation and consumption were profoundly affected by dirt. The lack of strict sanitation rules and the lack of knowledge about contamination led to constant exposure to diseases. 1. Food storage conditions. In cities, food was often stored in precarious conditions. Damp and poorly ventilated cellars promote mold. Proximity to waste and animal excrement, attracting rats and insects. Lack of refrigeration making meat and dairy products quickly perishable. In the countryside, food could be a little safer thanks to direct access to fresh produce, but conservation remained limited, especially in winter. 2. Meal preparation. Medieval kitchens, often located in common living areas or near stables, presented several health risks. Utensils and cutting boards were rarely washed. Water used for cooking or washing food was often stagnant or contaminated. Cooks' hands were not washed regularly, and the concept of germs was unknown. These conditions favored the spread of bacteria and parasites, causing food poisoning and intestinal diseases. 3. Pets and pests. The proximity to domestic and stray animals aggravated the situation. Rats, dogs and cats could contaminate food with their droppings. Stray chickens and poultry contributed to the spread of bacteria in yards and kitchens. Insects such as flies carried microbes from waste into food. 4. Eating habits and perception of dirt. Despite these conditions, the inhabitants adapted. Spices, salt, and alcohol were used to mask odors and extend shelf life, but did not eliminate bacteria. Some foods were boiled or roasted, which partially reduced health risks. Filth became a normal part of everyday life, and most residents were unaware of the direct link between unsanitary conditions and disease. 5. Health consequences. The combination of questionable storage, unsanitary preparation and contamination by animals resulted in frequent food poisoning, recurrent diarrhea and gastrointestinal illness, increased susceptibility to epidemics, since the immune system was often weakened by malnutrition and recurring infections. Legacy of medieval hygiene. An exploration of medieval hygiene reveals a striking picture: a society faced with dirt, odor, and disease, but which accommodated it largely for cultural, religious, and technical reasons. 1. Summary of practices and their consequences. From the street to the houses, from the baths to the kitchens, medieval daily life was marked by a widespread insalubrity. The streets were littered with garbage and mud, with stray animals and excrement everywhere. Baths were rare and often suspected of danger or vanity. The food was prepared in questionable conditions, promoting poisoning and infections. The influence of the church and cultural beliefs encouraged a certain tolerance of filth, reinforcing the sanitary backwardness of medieval Europe. These combined factors resulted in chronic diseases, epidemics, and high mortality, profoundly shaping society and its behavior. 2. Contrast with other civilizations. Compared to the Muslim world or some Asian societies, medieval Europe appeared to be lagging behind. Whereas hammams, public baths, and purification rituals were an integral part of daily life, cleanliness in the West remained sporadic and morally ambiguous. Foreign travelers were often shocked by European filth, highlighting the cultural contrast and showing that cleanliness is not a universal given but a social and religious construct. 3. The gradual evolution of hygiene. Despite these extreme conditions, gradual changes were beginning. Cities began to adopt rudimentary waste management and sanitation systems. Medicine and the understanding of disease evolved, setting the stage for the health transformations of the Renaissance and the modern era. Dietary and domestic practices slowly improved, influenced by trade, technology, and scientific knowledge. For legacy and lessons for our time. Medieval hygiene reminds us that public health, access to clean water, and bodily cleanliness are recent achievements, often forgotten in our modern societies. Diseases that once wreaked havoc are now controlled thanks to clean water, modern sanitation, and awareness of cleanliness. Culture and morality can still influence our hygiene behaviors, showing that habits do not only depend on available technologies. By looking at the Middle Ages, we understand better the importance of hygiene for human survival and well-being, and how much it has shaped history, society, and even morality. In conclusion, medieval hygiene was not only deplorable by our modern standards, but it was also intimately linked to culture, religion, and social organization. Understanding this era means understanding the roots of our current practices and the evolution of society in the face of health challenges.